The 9,899th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Great Lakes region. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Angola, Kenya, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Rwanda to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. On behalf of the Council, I wish to welcome His Excellency Mr. Tete Antonio, Minister for External Relations and Chairperson of the Executive Council of the African Union, and Her Excellency Ms. Thérèse Kaykwamba Wagner, State Minister, Minister for Foreign Affairs, International Cooperation, and Francophonie of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Huang Xia, Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for the Great Lakes region, and Ms. Catherine Russell, Executive Director, UNICEF. It is so decided.
Le Conseil de sécurité.
The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to the report of the Secretary-General on the implementation of the Peace, Security and Cooperation Framework for the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the region, document S/2025/2002. I now give the floor to Mr. Huang Xia, Special Envoy of the Secretary-General for the Great Lakes region. You are very welcome. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, Excellency, Madam Minister, State Minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Your Excellency, Minister of Foreign Relations of the Republic of Angola, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, distinguished members of the Security Council, thank you very much indeed for giving me this opportunity to present the report of the Secretary-General, which takes stock of the situation in the Great Lakes region. In preparation for this statement, I toured the region. That led me first to Angola, then to the Democratic Republic of Congo, to Burundi, to Rwanda, and then to Uganda. It was thus my honor to speak with heads of state or ministers from these countries, as well as with some members of the diplomatic community and civil society, and in particular, Congolese women. I pay particular tributes to them for their unfailing commitment to peace despite the difficult conditions they're experiencing. Over and beyond the points that I would like to bring to the attention of the Security Council as Special Envoy of the Secretary-General, I would also today, Mr. President, like to convey some messages from actors of the region, bearing in mind, of course, the question that is of concern to us all. How can we capitalize on the various different peace initiatives underway and, in fine, achieve lasting peace in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the epicenter of the deep-rooted crisis that has lasted for more than 30 years now? Mr. President, on the 27th of March, my colleague Bintu Keita, head of MONUSCO, presented here to you a comprehensive picture of the security and humanitarian situation in the east of the DRC. So I'm not going to go back to that, but I would just like to remind you this unambiguous call, despite the calls from the Security Council, from regional and sub-regional organizations in Africa, and also from the European Union, and despite the restrictive measures and sanctions that have been imposed, fighting is ongoing in the east of the DRC, and the Congo River Alliance M23 has continued its territorial expansion with external support. Despite statements of intent, a ceasefire is not yet effectively in force, and violations of international law and human rights are ongoing. Furthermore, the humanitarian crisis is worsening, both in the DRC and also in some neighboring countries, in particular Burundi, Uganda, and Rwanda. They have seen an increase in the number of new arrivals from the DRC. This somber reality means that we have to strive to redouble efforts to see how together we can transform recent political and diplomatic progress into an irreversible shift to peace. To this end, the first message of hope that we should bear in mind is that recent developments regarding the so-called Nairobi and Luanda peace processes, as well as the efforts of the African Union and the joint initiative of the EAC, the East African Community, and also SADC, have made significant strides and given new impetus to efforts to resolve the crisis. We need to recognize these, we need to encourage them and support them, despite the challenges that still exist. Indeed, the fact that the heads of state of the EAC and SADC adopted a roadmap on the 24th of March during the last joint summit, a roadmap that lays out immediate, medium-term and long-term measures, as well as the appointment of a facilitators group, which includes 2 distinguished women from Africa, is significant progress. I'd like to pay tribute to President João Lourenço, President of the African Union, for the immense work carried out as part of the Luanda process. The achievements of this must be preserved. Here, I'm thinking about the agreement on a CONOPS, a concept of operations to neutralize the Force de Libération du Rwanda, FDLR, and the lifting of defensive measures of Rwanda, which, if applied fully, will significantly contribute to mitigating tensions between the DRC and Rwanda. I would also like to commend the appointment of President Faure Gnassingbé from the Republic of Togo as African Union mediator for resolving the crisis between the DRC and Rwanda. Along the same lines, I'm delighted with the dynamism created by the Doha Initiative. I'd like to welcome the meeting initiated on the 18th of March in Doha by the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, between President Felix Tshisekedi and President Paul Kagame, as well as the various consultations with Qatari facilitation that ensued with delegations from the DRC, Rwanda, and the Congo River Alliance M23. These steps are a crucial turning point in efforts seeking to bring about a ceasefire on the ground and de-escalation of tensions between the DRC and Rwanda. Furthermore, the resumption of exchanges between the Burundi and Rwandan security services could well contribute to a de-escalation of tensions between these 2 countries. All these efforts show that peace is still possible. This is why, and this is my second message I'd like to convey, it is important for the parties to demonstrate good faith and to be prepared to compromise during negotiations to find a lasting settlement to the conflict in the east of the DRC. In this context, the new resolve of the Congolese government to engage in direct dialogue with the M23 is an important step towards finding a solution to the crisis. Given the serious nature of the crisis, obtaining an immediate, unconditional ceasefire and reaching agreement on reopening humanitarian corridors should, in my opinion, be the primary issue on the agenda of discussions between all parties concerned. These should include women and young people. We hope to see them involved as parties to the dialogue. Political negotiations should rapidly translate into a real change of the situation on the ground that is so yearned for by the people, in particular by the women of Goma, Bukavu, and Beni. It was my great honor to talk with them. They want arms to be laid down, and they want humanitarian assistance to get to them unhindered. To this end, we hope that the consultations held on the 28th of March between senior military officials from SADC and the Congo River Alliance M23 will lead to the swift reopening of Goma Airport. Mr. President, according to some authorities in the region with whom I spoke, and along the lines of the Doha communique of the 18th of March, the Doha Initiative seeks to strengthen trust by supporting African initiatives that are underway. This should be warmly welcomed. While all efforts seeking to bring about a settlement to the crisis are welcome, it is important that these initiatives dovetail with efforts from the region. My third message also seeks to reiterate the importance of close coordination and consistency between the praiseworthy initiatives started outside of Africa and regional peace processes. Indeed, taking such an approach would help to harness the comparative advantages of each approach and the achievements that have already been made in order to create complementarity and a unity of vision, but also to achieve in a systematic, structured way a robust and uncontested peace agreement. Such an approach would also enable stakeholders in the international community who so desire to better plan how they can support the peace efforts and to implement decisions which stem from them. Distinguished members of the Council, peace efforts will remain vain if real political resolve to tackle the root causes of the chronic instability in the region do not exist. What we've seen to date is that there is competition in terms of political ambitions and security ambitions, and these have been openly stated in terms of strategic areas of interest. They have been upheld by the existence of multiple armed groups. There's been the illegal exploitation of natural resources, and also we see the absence of the state's authority in these areas. So this indubitably is something that moves away from the spirit and the letter of the Addis Ababa Framework Agreement. I would like, therefore, to take this opportunity to reiterate my call to all signatory countries to respect the commitments undertaken under the Addis Ababa Agreement. Its revitalization process needs to continue unfailingly. Here, I would like to thank President Yoweri Museveni from Uganda, who has committed to host the 12th Summit of the Regional Mechanism for the Framework Agreement in May. I would urge the Security Council, through its discussions today, but also through its usual diplomatic channels, to tap into its influence and to use all levers at its disposal to reiterate its support for the peace process underway, to urge stakeholders in the region to work together sincerely in order to bring about a definitive, lasting settlement to the crisis by promoting the respect for international law, but also dialogue and compromise. Well, that is something that should be an obligation for all parties, because it's the very lives of civilians that depend on this more than ever. For my part, my office, in cooperation with regional and international stakeholders, and also the United Nations agencies involved as part of the Plan of Action for the United Nations Strategy for the Great Lakes region, that was recently updated for 2025-2027, my office will continue to support regional peace processes. We'll also continue to support economic, security, and judicial initiatives between countries in the region, and, of course, promote transparent and inclusive management of natural resources, because this is one of the main levers for resolving in a lasting fashion this crisis that has lasted for far too long. Thank you. I would like to thank the Special Envoy of the Secretary General, Mr. Huang Xia, for his briefing and his messages. And I'd now like to give the floor to the Executive Director of United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, Ms. Catherine Russell. You have the floor, Madam.
Excellencies, good afternoon. It's very good to be here for this important discussion on the deepening humanitarian crisis in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'd like to thank Ambassador Bonifant very much for convening and hosting this briefing during France's presidency of the Security Council. The Security Council's continued attention to children affected by armed conflict in the DRC is more critical now than ever. Excellencies, the significant escalation of conflict in the eastern region of the DRC has reached levels not seen in the last 3 decades. The intensifying violence has created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, leaving millions of children at risk. Since January, more than 1 million people, including an estimated 400,000 children, have been displaced by violence in the eastern provinces of Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu. This new wave of displacement comes in addition to the more than 5 million people in the region who were already living in displacement camps, where crowded and unsanitary conditions increase the likelihood of diseases such as mpox, cholera, and measles. Excellencies, I'd like to draw special attention to the most defining and horrifying feature of this conflict, the rampant violence being committed against children and women. Scores have been killed or injured. There has been a 100% increase in verified grave violations against children in the first quarter of this year as compared to the first quarter of 2024. These include indiscriminate attacks, large-scale recruitment and use of children, collective abductions of children, as well as widespread sexual violence. The rate of sexual violence against children has reached shocking levels. Reports from child protection partners show that children make up more than 40% of the nearly 10,000 cases of rape and sexual violence reported in January and February alone. UNICEF estimates that during the most intense phase of this year's conflict in eastern DRC, a child was raped every half hour. This clearly points to a systemic crisis in which rape and other forms of sexual violence are being used as weapons of war to destroy lives, families, and communities. Please bear in mind these numbers represent only the cases that have been reported. The true figure is likely significantly higher, hidden by fear, stigma, and insecurity. This sexual violence against children is an abomination. and demands condemnation and urgent and collective action. Cases of abduction of children have also increased sixfold between December 2024 and February of this year. These increases are accompanied by reports of other serious violations of children's rights, including killing and maiming of children and threats by armed groups against children living on the street. In addition, repeated mass displacement and the disruption of essential services have created ideal conditions for the spread of endemic diseases. Children under 5, many of whom face chronic malnutrition already, are especially at risk of disease. DRC also remains the epicenter of the outbreak of the new Mpox strain. Of course, the Mpox response continues to be heavily impacted by the conflict. For example, most of the 143 Mpox patients in isolation units in Goma had to flee for safety, making it nearly impossible to provide them with care and increasing the risk of the disease spreading beyond DRC's borders. At the same time, healthcare facilities have been overwhelmed, and medical supplies are being quickly depleted, including post-exposure prophylaxis, or PEP kits, used to treat rape survivors who may have been exposed to HIV or other sexually transmitted infections. Since the start of the year, more than 2,500 schools and learning spaces in North and South Kivu, including those in displacement camps, have been forced to close, putting children at further risk. Schools play a crucial role in times of crisis, providing stability and a safe place that protects children from sexual violence and recruitment by armed groups. Making matters worse, violence and insecurity are undermining commercial trade and the ability of humanitarian actors to reach children and families in need. At least 11 humanitarian workers have been killed since January. Humanitarian premises and warehouses have been looted, including the 2 Mpox treatment centers supported by UNICEF in Goma and UNICEF's warehouse in Bukavu. Partners who have largely relied on MONUSCO's maintenance of core infrastructure that facilitates humanitarian access, including roads and airstrips, are now experiencing challenges in reaching remote areas because of the MONUSCO drawdown. Despite these challenges, UNICEF is staying and delivering for children and families in eastern DRC. Key operational staff have remained in Goma and Bukavu, along with our NGO partners throughout the worst of the fighting. UNICEF's response is focused on the provision of life-saving assistance to reach people most in need in displacement sites and host communities. UNICEF interventions include emergency water trucking, rehabilitation of water supply systems, establishing chlorination points along Lake Kivu, and distribution of emergency wash supplies. We are now reaching 700,000 people a day in Goma with clean water and sanitation. In addition, UNICEF has been supplying medicines and medical equipment, including PEP kits. We are working with partners to provide support to survivors of sexual violence and to assist children with mental health services. And we are supporting registration and care for unaccompanied and separated children so they can be reunited with their families. But this is far from enough, and the humanitarian response is facing a critical funding shortfall. In 2024, UNICEF received only 20% of the funding required to address the urgent needs of children and families in eastern DRC, leaving millions without access to life-saving aid. Recently, we launched an urgent appeal for nearly $57 million to provide emergency assistance to children in the eastern DRC over the next 3 months. If the funding crisis isn't urgently addressed, hundreds of thousands of children in eastern DRC will miss out on screening and treatment for malnutrition, on life-saving medicines and vaccines, on safe drinking water, and on psychosocial support. UNICEF echoes the call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2773, which calls for de-escalation, dialogue, and protection of civilians, especially children. We urge all parties to the conflict, those who support them and those with influence over them, to work collectively and decisively toward peace. We urge all parties to the conflict to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law and human rights law, particularly those related to the protection of children. We call for full accountability for those who recruit children, commit sexual violence, or target civilians. Impunity must not prevail. Excellencies, in closing, I urge Council members to commit to several actions that are critical to alleviating the humanitarian crisis in the eastern DRC. first is to demand that parties to the conflict and those with influence over them ensure the protection of children and the civilian infrastructure they depend upon. Parties must abide by their legal responsibilities to ensure the safety and protection of children, including protection from recruitment and sexual violence. In doing so, the government of the DRC should continue to engage on the implementation of the 2012 Action Plan, and this council should urge other parties to the conflict to constructively engage with the UN to sign action plans to end and prevent grave violations against children. Next is to facilitate safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access. This includes ensuring that international borders to neighboring countries remain open for the voluntary movement of displaced civilians, as well as humanitarian supplies and personnel. All parties must allow and facilitate the passage of impartial humanitarian relief for civilians in need, and ensure that humanitarian workers and operations are respected and protected. Finally, pending a cessation of hostilities, I call on council members to urge parties to the conflict to agree on temporary humanitarian pauses in the most affected areas so as to ensure humanitarian activities can resume at scale, and to facilitate medical evacuations for children and civilians trapped in combat zones. Parties must also facilitate voluntary, safe, and dignified returns for internally displaced people. The conflict in the eastern DRC has spiraled. Horrific violence and skyrocketing humanitarian need are obviously clear and present everywhere. The situation can and must change. It is up to this council and the international community to champion a stronger humanitarian response, which includes providing sustained funding and to drive the parties towards peace. DRC's children deserve nothing less. If we fail to act with urgency, we condemn a generation of children to fear, to trauma, and to a future defined by violence. But if we stand together for peace, accountability, and protection, we offer these children something else: hope. Merci beaucoup.
Je remercie.
I thank the Executive Director for UNICEF, Ms. Catherine Russell, for her comments and for her appeals. And now I give the floor to His Excellency